The brick struck Marcus Williams' temple with a sickening thud that echoed through the manicured streets of Willowbrook Estates. Blood immediately began streaming down the 13-year-old's face as he crumpled from his bicycle, his backpack spilling schoolbooks across the pristine sidewalk. Karen Mitchell stood frozen for exactly 3 seconds, her manicured hand still raised from the throwing motion, before she realized what she had done. The iPhone of a neighbor across the street captured every horrific moment, the lens trembling as Mrs. Patterson whispered, "Oh my God. Oh my God." Into the afternoon silence. Marcus had been riding home from Washington Middle School, just as he did every Tuesday, his bicycle wheels humming against the asphalt as he navigated the familiar route through the subdivision where his family had lived for 8 years. His father, Police Chief David Williams, had purchased the house on Maple Drive specifically for its proximity to good schools and safe neighborhoods. Marcus loved these rides home, the wind in his face, the freedom of movement after 7 hours of sitting in classrooms. Today, he had been particularly happy, clutching his science test in his backpack. A 96%. His father would be proud. The boy had no idea that Karen Mitchell, the self-appointed guardian of Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, had been watching him from her living room window for weeks. In her twisted mind, she had constructed an elaborate fantasy about this young black boy who dared to ride his bicycle through her neighborhood. She had convinced herself that he was casing houses, planning break-ins, bringing crime to their peaceful community. The fact that Marcus lived 3 houses down from her meant nothing to Karen. In her warped worldview, he was an intruder, a threat, someone who needed to be dealt with. On this particular Tuesday, Karen had reached her breaking point. She had spent the morning stewing over what she perceived as an invasion, pacing her marble-floored foyer, while muttering about property values and neighborhood safety. When she saw Marcus turn the corner onto Maple Drive, something snapped inside her. She grabbed the decorative brick from her garden border and stormed outside, her designer heels clicking against the walkway like gunshots. "Hey!" Karen had screamed, her voice shrill and filled with venom. "You don't belong here. Stop trespassing on private property." Marcus had stopped his bicycle, confused and frightened. He recognized the woman from the neighborhood, but had never spoken to her. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I live here. I'm just going home." His voice was polite, respectful, exactly the way his parents had taught him to address adults. But Karen was beyond reason. "Liar, I've been watching you. You're scouting houses, planning robberies. I'm calling the police." She pulled out her phone, but Marcus, panicked and confused, had started pedaling again, trying to reach the safety of his own home just 3 houses away. That's when Karen had thrown the brick, not in a moment of passionate anger, but with calculated precision, aiming for the boy's head as he rode past. The throw was perfect, deadly in its accuracy. "Go home where you belong," she had screamed as the brick left her hand, her face twisted with hate. Now. As Marcus lay unconscious on the sidewalk, blood pooling beneath his head, Karen finally began to understand the magnitude of what she had done. Mrs. Patterson was running toward them, her phone already dialing 911. Other neighbors were emerging from their houses, drawn by the commotion. Karen could hear someone shouting for towels, for pressure on the wound, for someone to call his parents. "I didn't mean..." He was trespassing. "I was protecting..." Karen stammered, but her words fell on deaf ears. The neighbors who had gathered around Marcus's unconscious form looked at her with a mixture of horror and disgust. The ambulance arrived within 6 minutes, followed closely by 2 police cars. The paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Marcus, his small body looking even smaller on the gurney as they loaded him into the ambulance. Karen watched from her front steps, still clutching her phone, as the vehicle sped away with sirens wailing. Officer Jennifer Martinez, the first responder, had immediately recognized the address. This was Chief Williams's house. The boy being loaded into the ambulance was the chief's son. She approached Karen with professional calm, though her hands were trembling. "Ma'am, I need you to tell me exactly what happened here." Karen's story kept changing. First, she claimed Marcus had threatened her. Then she said he had been vandalizing property. Finally, she admitted to throwing the brick, but insisted it was self-defense. Officer Martinez listened to each version with growing incredulity, especially when Mrs. Patterson approached with her phone. "Officer, I recorded the whole thing. That woman threw a brick at a child who was just riding his bicycle home from school." The video was damning. It showed Marcus pedaling peacefully down the street, Karen running after him with the brick, and the vicious throw that sent the boy tumbling to the ground. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. Karen Mitchell had committed attempted murder in broad daylight, and it was all captured in high definition. Chief Williams arrived at the hospital 20 minutes after the ambulance. His wife, Dr. Sarah Williams, had been called from her practice at the community clinic. Together, they held hands in the emergency room waiting area, praying for news about their son. When Dr. Rebecca Chen, the trauma surgeon, finally emerged from the operating room, her expression was grim. "The injury is severe," Dr. Chen explained, her voice gentle but direct. "The brick caused significant trauma to the temporal lobe. We've managed to relieve the pressure, but Marcus is in a coma. We won't know the extent of the damage until he wakes up." "When will he wake up?" Sarah asked, her medical training unable to prevent the tremor in her voice. "We don't know. It could be days, weeks, or—" Dr. Chen didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The Williams family understood the implications. Chief Williams had been a police officer for 22 years, but he had never felt more helpless than he did sitting beside his son's hospital bed. The boy's head was wrapped in bandages, machines monitoring his vital signs, tubes helping him breathe. David reached for his son's hand, the same hand that had excitedly shown him artwork from school just 2 days ago. "I should have been there," he whispered to his wife. "I should have protected him." Sarah squeezed her husband's shoulder. "You can't be everywhere, David. This isn't your fault. This is on that woman who threw the brick." But David Williams, respected police chief and pillar of the community, felt the weight of every conversation he'd had with his son about being careful, about being respectful, about not giving anyone an excuse to see him as a threat. He had taught Marcus to be polite, to comply, to never give anyone a reason to fear him. And still, it hadn't been enough. A 13-year-old boy riding his bicycle home from school had been seen as dangerous enough to warrant a brick to the head. News of the attack spread through the community like wildfire. By evening, the video had been shared hundreds of times on social media. Local news stations were calling for interviews. The story had all the elements that made for viral content: a young victim, a clear aggressor, and shocking footage of the crime itself. Karen Mitchell, meanwhile, had been arrested and charged with aggravated assault. She sat in her jail cell, still insisting that she had been defending herself and her neighborhood. "You don't understand," she told the public defender assigned to her case. "These people, they don't belong here. They bring crime. They bring violence." Attorney Michael Foster had been practicing criminal defense for 15 years, but he had never encountered a client quite like Karen Mitchell. Her complete lack of remorse, her twisted reasoning, her inability to see Marcus as anything other than a threat, made his job nearly impossible. "Mrs. Mitchell, you threw a brick at a child's head. That child is now in a coma. Do you understand the gravity of this situation? I was protecting my community, Karen replied, her voice flat and emotionless. Someone had to take action. Foster realized that his client was not only guilty, but potentially dangerous. Her complete disconnect from reality, her inability to see Marcus as a human being deserving of compassion, suggested something far more sinister than a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a woman who had calculated her actions, who had convinced herself that violence against a child was justified. The community's response was swift and decisive. By the second day after the attack, neighbors had organized a vigil outside the hospital. People brought flowers, balloons, and signs reading, "Justice for Marcus" and "Love over hate." The diversity of the crowd was striking Black families, white families, Hispanic families, Asian families, all united in their support for the Williams family and their outrage at Karen's actions. Pastor James Thompson from the First Baptist Church stepped forward to address the crowd. We are here today, not just to pray for Marcus Williams, but to send a message to our community and to the world. We will not tolerate hate. We will not tolerate violence against our children. We will not tolerate the poisonous thinking that led to this tragedy. The crowd responded with amens and applause. Rabbi Sarah Goldman from Temple Beth Shalom joined Pastor Thompson, followed by Imam Hassan al-Rashid from the Islamic Center. The interfaith unity was powerful, a visible demonstration that Marcus's attack had touched the entire community. But the vigil was only the beginning. As word spread that Karen Mitchell had been released on bail, the community's anger intensified. She had returned to her house on Maple Drive, just 3 doors down from where Marcus lay, fighting for his life. The sight of her watering her flowers, checking her mail, going about her daily routine as if nothing had happened, was too much for the neighbors to bear. Mrs. Patterson, who had filmed the attack, organized a neighborhood watch that was less about watching for crime and more about watching Karen. She's shown us who she is. Mrs. Patterson told the growing group of concerned residents. We need to make sure she knows that her actions have consequences. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed disturbing details about Karen's mental state. Dr. Amanda Torres, the court-appointed psychiatrist, found evidence of paranoid delusions, racial bias, and a complete lack of empathy. Mrs. Mitchell exhibits classic signs of paranoid personality disorder, combined with deeply ingrained racial prejudices that have been allowed to fester unchecked. Dr. Torres wrote in her report, the evaluation also revealed that Karen had been making complaints to the Homeowners Association about Marcus for months. She had filed 17 different reports claiming that the boy was suspicious, up to no good, and a threat to neighborhood safety. The fact that Marcus lived in the neighborhood, attended the local school, and had never been in trouble with the law meant nothing to Karen. In her mind, his very existence was a problem to be solved. District Attorney Patricia Vance reviewed the case with her senior prosecutors. The evidence was overwhelming: the video, the witness testimony, the medical reports, the psychiatric evaluation. But Vance knew that this case was about more than just one woman's actions. It was about sending a message to the community and the nation about the consequences of racial hatred and violence. We're going to upgrade the charges, Vance announced to her team. Attempted murder in the first degree, with hate crime enhancements. This woman planned her attack, executed it with precision, and showed no remorse afterward. If Marcus dies, we'll be looking at murder charges. The news of the upgraded charges sent shockwaves through both the community and Karen's family. Her husband, Robert Mitchell, had been trying to distance himself from his wife's actions, but the severity of the charges made it impossible to ignore. He filed for divorce the same day the charges were announced, citing irreconcilable differences and requesting that his name be removed from all shared assets. Karen's 2 adult children, who lived in other states, released a joint statement condemning their mother's actions. "We are horrified by what our mother did to Marcus Williams. Her actions do not represent our values or our family. We are praying for Marcus's recovery and supporting the Williams family during this difficult time." The isolation was complete. Karen Mitchell, who had believed herself to be a defender of community values, found herself completely alone. Her friends avoided her calls, her neighbors shunned her, and even her own family had turned their backs on her. She sat in her empty house, surrounded by the perfect lawn and pristine landscaping that she had valued more than a child's life. Meanwhile, Marcus remained in his coma. His parents took turns sitting beside his bed, talking to him, playing his favorite music, showing him pictures from family vacations. Dr. Chen had explained that coma patients often could hear and understand what was happening around them. So the Williams family filled their son's room with love and hope. "Remember when we went to the Science Museum last summer?" David Williams said, holding his son's hand. "You were so excited about the planetarium show. You said you wanted to be an astronaut and explore Mars. You're going to wake up, son. You're going to chase those dreams." Sarah Williams, despite her medical training, found herself clinging to every small sign of hope. A twitch of Marcus's fingers, a slight change in his breathing pattern, anything that might indicate he was fighting his way back to consciousness. She had reduced her hours at the clinic to spend more time at the hospital, and her colleagues had rallied around her, covering her patients and supporting her family. The community support was overwhelming. Marcus's classmates at Washington Middle School had organized fundraisers to help with medical expenses. The local businesses had contributed to a scholarship fund in Marcus's name. The mayor had declared a day of unity, encouraging residents to come together and reject the hatred that had led to the attack. But the most powerful moment came when Chief Williams made an unexpected decision. Instead of recusing himself from the case, he asked District Attorney Vance to allow him to make a statement at Karen's arraignment. "I want to look her in the eye," he told his wife. "I want her to see the father of the boy she tried to kill." The arraignment took place 3 weeks after the attack. Karen Mitchell stood before Judge Robert Harrison, her hands shackled, her face emotionless. When Chief Williams was called to make his victim impact statement, the courtroom fell silent. He approached the podium slowly, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming, his eyes fixed on Karen. "My son Marcus is 13 years old," Chief Williams began, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "He loves science, basketball, and riding his bicycle. He gets good grades, helps his neighbors, and has never been in trouble a day in his life. 3 weeks ago, you threw a brick at his head because you decided he didn't belong in our neighborhood." Karen shifted uncomfortably, but maintained eye contact with the chief. Her attorney had advised her to show remorse, to appear sympathetic, but Karen's expression remained blank. "I've been a police officer for 22 years. Chief Williams continued. "I've seen violence. I've seen hatred. I've seen the worst that humanity has to offer. But I have never seen anything as senseless, as cruel, as cowardly as what you did to my son. You threw a brick at a child who was riding his bicycle home from school." The chief's voice began to crack, but he pressed on. "Marcus may never wake up. He may never ride his bicycle again. He may never achieve his dreams of becoming an astronaut. You took that from him, from our family, from our community. And for what? Because you were afraid of a 13-year-old boy on a bicycle." Judge Harrison, a veteran of the bench who had presided over countless criminal cases, found himself moved by the chief's words. The man before him wasn't just a police officer. He was a father whose world had been shattered by senseless violence. Your Honor, Chief Williams concluded, I'm not asking for vengeance. I'm asking for justice. I'm asking that you send a message to our community that violence against children, violence motivated by hate, violence against the innocent, will not be tolerated. When Chief Williams finished his statement, the courtroom erupted in applause. Judge Harrison had to gavel for order, but even he seemed moved by the chief's words. Karen's attorney requested a recess, realizing that his client's chances of avoiding a lengthy prison sentence had just evaporated. But the real turning point came the next day. When Marcus opened his eyes, Sarah Williams was reading to him from his favorite book when she noticed his eyelids fluttering. Marcus, can you hear me? She pressed the call button for the nurse while taking her son's hand. Marcus's eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then gradually finding his mother's face. Mom. His voice was weak, barely a whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound Sarah had ever heard. I'm here, baby. I'm here. Sarah was crying now, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. Dad's here too. We're both here. David Williams had been in the hospital cafeteria when he received the call. He ran through the corridors, his heart pounding, not caring who saw the police chief sprinting through the hospital like a man possessed. When he reached Marcus's room and saw his son's eyes open, he broke down completely. Hey, Dad, Marcus whispered, attempting a smile. Did I miss anything important? The next few days were a whirlwind of medical tests, evaluations, and gradual recovery. Marcus had some memory gaps from the day of the attack, but his cognitive functions appeared to be intact. Doctor, Chen was cautiously optimistic about his recovery, though she warned that he would need months of physical therapy and monitoring. The news of Marcus's awakening spread through the community like wildfire. The vigil outside the hospital transformed into a celebration. People brought balloons, flowers, and signs reading, "Welcome back, Marcus," and "Miracles happen." The outpouring of love and support was overwhelming, but the community's attention soon turned back to Karen Mitchell. With Marcus awake and on the road to recovery, the charges against her were adjusted to aggravated assault and hate crime enhancements. The attempted murder charge was dropped, but she still faced the possibility of decades in prison. The trial began 2 months later. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Karen Mitchell had thrown a brick at a child's head in a racially motivated attack. The defense tried to argue that Karen was mentally ill, that she had been manipulated by fear and paranoia, that she deserved treatment rather than punishment. But the jury wasn't buying it. They had seen the video, heard the testimony, and witnessed Karen's complete lack of remorse. After deliberating for less than 4 hours, they returned with a guilty verdict on all charges. Karen Mitchell was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Judge Harrison's sentencing statement was scathing. Mrs. Mitchell, you have shown this court that you are incapable of seeing a 13-year-old boy as anything other than a threat. Your actions were not those of a person defending herself or her community. They were the actions of someone consumed by hatred and prejudice. You threw a brick at a child's head because of the color of his skin. That is not justice. That is not protection. That is attempted murder, motivated by hate. Karen stood emotionless as the sentence was read. She had been offered several plea deals that would have reduced her sentence, but she had refused them all, insisting that she was innocent, that she had been protecting her neighborhood. Even now, facing 15 years in prison, she maintained that she had done nothing wrong. The Williams family chose not to attend the sentencing. They had said their piece during the trial, and they were focused on Marcus's recovery and their family's healing. Chief Williams had returned to work, though he had implemented several new initiatives in the police department focused on community engagement and bias training. "We can't let what happened to Marcus happen to anyone else," Chief Williams told his officers during a department meeting. "We need to be better. We need to do better. We need to make sure every child in our community feels safe." Sarah Williams had returned to her clinic, but she had also begun working with the local school district to implement anti-bullying and diversity programs. She spoke at PTA meetings, community groups, and anywhere else that would listen about the importance of seeing children as individuals rather than threats. "Marcus is not a symbol," she would tell her audiences. "He's not a poster child for anything. He's a 13-year-old boy who loves science and basketball, and riding his bicycle. But what happened to him could happen to any of our children if we don't address the fear and hatred that exist in our community." Marcus himself had become something of a local celebrity, though he was uncomfortable with the attention. He had returned to school after 3 months of recovery, and while he still dealt with occasional headaches and fatigue, he was largely back to his normal self. The experience had changed him, though. He was more aware of the world around him, more conscious of the way people looked at him, more careful about where he rode his bicycle. "I don't want to be afraid," he told his parents one evening. "But sometimes I am. Sometimes I wonder if there are other people like her out there, watching me, waiting for me to do something wrong." David Williams sat down beside his son. "There might be, son. But there are also people like Mrs. Patterson, who stood up for you. People like Dr. Chen, who saved your life. People like all the neighbors who prayed for you and supported our family. The good people outnumber the bad ones." "But why did she hate me so much?" Marcus asked. "I never did anything to her. I never even talked to her." Sarah Williams took her son's hand. "Some people are taught to fear what they don't understand. Some people let that fear turn into hatred. What happened to you wasn't about you, Marcus. It was about her, about the poison in her heart." The Williams family had decided to channel their experience into something positive. They established the Marcus Williams Foundation, dedicated to promoting understanding between different communities and preventing violence against children. The foundation funded anti-bias training in schools, supported victims of hate crimes, and worked to create safe spaces for children of all backgrounds. The foundation's first major initiative was a community bike ride, starting from the spot where Marcus had been attacked and ending at the hospital where he had recovered. Hundreds of riders participated, including the mayor, the police chief, and representatives from every major community organization. Marcus led the ride, his helmet decorated with stickers from his classmates. "This is about more than just one person's hatred," Chief Williams told the crowd at the starting line. "This is about building a community where every child feels safe, where every family feels welcome, where differences are celebrated rather than feared." The ride was a powerful symbol of the community's transformation. Where once there had been fear and division, there was now unity and hope. The neighbors who had once been strangers were now friends. The children who had once been afraid were now confident and supported. Karen Mitchell watched the news coverage of the bike ride from her prison cell. She had been in prison for 6 months, and the isolation had begun to take its toll. Her cellmate, a woman named Rosa, who was serving time for drug possession, had tried to engage her in conversation, but Karen remained convinced that she was the victim, that she was being punished for trying to protect her community. "You see that boy on the news?" Rosa asked one evening. "The one you hurt? He's doing good things. He's helping people." Karen turned away from the television. "He's a criminal. They all are. You'll see." Rosa shook her head. "Lady, I've been in and out of prison for 10 years. I know criminals. That boy ain't no criminal. He's a kid who got hurt by someone who should have known better." But Karen was beyond redemption. The prison counselors had tried to work with her, to help her understand the impact of her actions, but she remained convinced that she had been justified in throwing the brick. She had created an elaborate fantasy in which she was the hero, the defender of innocent families against a dangerous threat. The psychiatrists who evaluated her during her imprisonment diagnosed her with severe paranoid personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and racial bias that bordered on delusional. They recommended intensive therapy, but Karen refused to participate. She saw the mental health professionals as part of a conspiracy against her, part of the system that was trying to convince her that she was wrong. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to thrive. He had returned to riding his bicycle, though now he wore a helmet and stayed on designated bike paths. He had also become an advocate for other children who had been victims of violence, speaking at schools and community events about the importance of reporting suspicious behavior and standing up for those who were being targeted. "I don't want other kids to go through what I went through," he told an audience at the community center. "If you see someone being mean to someone else because of how they look or where they come from, don't just stand there. Tell a teacher. Tell a parent. Tell a police officer. Don't let hate win." The impact of Marcus's story had spread far beyond Willowbrook Estates. His foundation had received donations from across the country, and his message of hope and resilience had inspired similar initiatives in other communities. Major news networks had covered his story, and he had been invited to speak at national conferences on youth violence and community healing. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from his own neighborhood. 2 years after the attack, the residents of Willowbrook Estates voted to rename the street where Marcus had been attacked. Maple Drive became Marcus Williams Way, a permanent reminder of the boy who had survived hatred and helped heal a community. The dedication ceremony was held on a beautiful spring morning. Marcus, now 15 and taller than his father, stood before the new street sign with his parents. The crowd included neighbors, classmates, city officials, and people from across the community who had been touched by his story. Mayor Patricia Johnson spoke first. 2 years ago, our community was wounded by an act of senseless violence. A young boy was hurt simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. According to someone who couldn't see past her own fear and hatred. But that boy, Marcus Williams, didn't let that attack define him. Instead, he chose to use his experience to make our community stronger, more united, more committed to protecting all of our children. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he looked out at the crowd of familiar faces. These were the people who had prayed for him, supported his family, and helped him heal. These were the people who had chosen love over hate, unity over division. "When I was in the hospital, I couldn't understand why someone would want to hurt me," Marcus said, his voice clear and strong. "I kept asking my parents why that lady hated me so much. They told me it wasn't about me. It was about fear, about not understanding, about letting that fear turn into something ugly." He paused, looking at the street sign that now bore his name. "I used to be scared to ride my bike. I used to wonder if there were other people watching me, waiting for me to do something wrong. But then I realized that for every person like her, there are 100 people like you. People who care about kids, who want to protect them, who see them as human beings worthy of love and respect." The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. Marcus had grown from a frightened boy into a confident young man, and his words carried the weight of his experience. "This street sign isn't about me," he continued. "It's about all of us. It's about the choice we make every day to see each other as human beings, to treat each other with kindness, to stand up for what's right. It's about making sure that what happened to me never happens to another child in our community." When Marcus finished speaking, the crowd erupted in applause. People were crying, hugging, and celebrating not just the boy who had survived, but the community that had chosen to heal rather than divide. Chief Williams watched his son with pride. The boy who had once been afraid to ride his bicycle was now inspiring others to stand up against hatred and violence. The attack that had nearly destroyed their family had instead made them stronger, more united, more committed to making the world a better place for all children. Sarah Williams stood beside her husband, her hand in his, watching their son address the crowd. The doctor in her marveled at his physical recovery, but the mother in her was amazed by his emotional strength. He had taken the worst experience of his life and turned it into a force for good. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, Marcus approached the spot where he had been attacked. The bloodstains were long gone. The sidewalk had been power washed and repaired. But he could still remember the moment when everything changed. He knelt down and placed his hand on the concrete, not in fear or anger, but in gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was thanking. Maybe it was God. Maybe it was the community that had rallied around him. Maybe it was his own strength that had carried him through the darkest days. Mrs. Patterson, who had filmed the attack and become something of a community hero herself, approached Marcus. "You know, I still have that video on my phone. I've thought about deleting it 100 times, but I keep it as a reminder." "A reminder of what?" Marcus asked. "That one person's hatred can hurt a lot of people, but it can also bring out the best in everyone else. That video showed the worst of humanity, but everything that happened after showed the best." Marcus nodded, understanding what she meant. The attack had been horrible, traumatic, life-changing, but it had also revealed the strength and love that existed in their community. It had shown that when people came together, when they chose to stand up for what was right, they could overcome even the darkest hatred. As the Williams family walked home together, Marcus riding his bicycle slowly beside his parents, they passed the house where Karen Mitchell had lived. It was empty now, a for sale sign in the front yard that had been there for months. No one wanted to buy the house where the woman who had thrown the brick had lived. It had become a symbol of everything the community had rejected. "Do you ever think about her?" Marcus asked his parents. "Sometimes," his father admitted. "I wonder if she's learned anything, if she understands what she did. But mostly, I try not to think about her. She's in prison. She's facing the consequences of her actions. Our focus is on moving forward, on building something better. I hope she gets help," Marcus said, surprising his parents. "I hope she learns that kids like me aren't scary. We're just kids." Sarah Williams looked at her son with amazement. After everything he had been through, after all the pain and trauma, he could still find compassion for the woman who had nearly killed him. That was the measure of the young man he had become. Karen Mitchell, meanwhile, remained in prison, serving her sentence and refusing to acknowledge the harm she had caused. The appeals process had been unsuccessful, and she faced many more years behind bars. Her family had moved on. Her friends had abandoned her, and she had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked hatred and prejudice. But the story of Marcus Williams had become something else entirely. It had become a story of resilience, of community, of the power of love to overcome hate. It had become a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was hope. Even when one person chose violence, hundreds of others chose compassion. 5 years after the attack, Marcus Williams graduated from high school as valedictorian. His speech at graduation was about the importance of seeing each other as human beings, of choosing love over fear, of building communities where every child could thrive. He had been accepted to several prestigious universities, and he planned to study criminal justice and social work, following in his father's footsteps while forging his own path. The Marcus Williams Foundation had grown into a national organization, with chapters in dozens of cities. The foundation's work had prevented numerous incidents of violence, helped countless victims of hate crimes, and created safe spaces for children across the country. What had started as a family's response to tragedy had become a movement for change. As Marcus prepared to leave for college, he took one last bike ride through his neighborhood. He pedaled slowly down Marcus Williams Way, past the spot where he had been attacked, past the house where Karen Mitchell had lived, past the homes of the neighbors who had become his extended family. The streets were filled with children playing, families walking, people living their lives without fear. This was the community that had been built from the ashes of hatred. This was the neighborhood where every child was safe, where every family was welcome, where differences were celebrated rather than feared. This was the legacy of a 13-year-old boy who had been attacked for the crime of riding his bicycle while black, and who had chosen to respond with love rather than hate. The brick that Karen Mitchell had thrown had been intended to hurt, to intimidate, to drive away. Instead, it had become the foundation for something beautiful. It had brought a community together, inspired a movement for change, and proven that even the darkest hatred could not extinguish the light of human compassion. As Marcus rode away to begin his new life, the sun was setting over Willowbrook Estates. The golden light illuminated the street sign that bore his name, a permanent reminder of the boy who had survived, the community that had healed, and the love that had triumphed over hate. In the distance, children were still playing, still laughing, still dreaming of bright futures in a world where they knew they were safe, loved, and valued. The story of Marcus Williams was no longer just about one terrible day when a brick was thrown. It had become a story of hope, of healing, of the unbreakable bonds that unite communities when they choose to stand together against hatred. It was a story that would be told for generations, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always the possibility of light.